Section 4F of the Department of Transportation Act of 1966 applies only to departments of transportation and specifies that a transportation project requiring the use of publicly owned parks, recreation areas, historic sites, which include those owned privately, wildlife and waterfowl refuges, and many other types of resources can be approved only if there is no feasible and prudent alternate to using that land and if the project is planned to minimize harm to the property. These types of properties are often referred to as Section 4F resources. Transportation projects that receive federal funding may not adversely affect public land unless there are no feasible alternatives and all avoidance and minimization measures have been implemented. Section 4F protects public lands including public parks, recreation areas, wildlife refuges, and properties eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. Section 4F, as it pertains to cultural resources, is discussed in the Cultural Resources presentation. Early coordination is important when projects impact or could potentially impact any public recreation resource or private historic site that the Federal Highway Administration considers eligible for Section 4F protection. The district must provide information for the environmental specialist to use in preparing documentation for the Federal Highway Administration to make the eligibility determination. Section 6F of the Land and Water Conservation Fund Act, or LWCF, establishes a grant program for the acquisition and development of public outdoor recreation facilities for community, county, and state parks, trails, fairgrounds, conservation areas, boat ramps, shooting ranges, etc. Like Section 4F, this program requires similar restrictions for public recreation facilities funded with LWCF monies. Impacts to LWCF-assisted facilities require mitigation, including replacement land of at least equal value and recreational utility as existing recreation land. If Section 6F applies, Section 4F will also apply because of the impacts to a public recreation property. MoDOT environmental specialists monitor all federally funded roadway improvement projects for compliance with Section 4F and Section 6F requirements. During the location and conceptual plan stage, if right-of-way and easement information is available, the environmental specialist will screen the project for public lands using all available resources. If no public lands are identified or there would be no impact to public lands identified in and around the project limits, no further action is required. If public lands are identified and impacts are unavoidable, the environmental specialist will coordinate with the district and the appropriate agencies to complete the Section 6F or required level of Section 4F documentation. During the preliminary plan stage, if right-of-way takings, ownership, and/or the public land management plan has changed since the initial screening, the environmental specialist will conduct another review of the project. If no public lands are identified or there would be no impact to public lands identified in and around the project limits, no further action is required. If public lands are found and impacts are unavoidable, the environmental specialist will coordinate with the district and appropriate agencies to complete the Section 6F or required level of Section 4F documentation. Section 4F documentation and approval should be completed at this stage. Like the preliminary plan stage, the right-of-way plan stage will require the environmental specialist to review the project again if any of the project details have changed. If new impacts to public lands are determined and are unavoidable, the environmental specialist will coordinate with the district and the appropriate agencies to complete the Section 6F or required level of Section 4F documentation. During the final design plan stage, any necessary Section 4F or Section 6F documentation and approval should be completed. If impacts to public lands are unavoidable and Section 4F, Section 6F documentation and approval have not been completed by this stage, The project could be delayed until all documentation is completed and approved by MoDOT and/or the Federal Highway Administration. Any necessary Section 4F or Section 6F documentation and approval should be completed by the letting date. If new or additional public lands are discovered at the time of project letting and impacts are unavoidable, no construction work of any kind must occur on the affected property until the environmental specialist coordinates with the district and the appropriate agencies to complete the appropriate level of Section 4F or Section 6F documentation. The environmental specialist will notify the district when construction can proceed. When completing the RES for submittal to environmental staff, the district should do their best to identify Section 4F resources using a variety of sources. These include the U.S. Geological Service Protected Area Database, Google Earth Parks and Recreation Areas, the City or County GIS Mapper, the National Register of Historic Places, and/or MoDOT's ArcMap GIS Public Land Layers. The district should provide a description in the RES of any Section 4F properties near the project and describe what, if any, impacts may occur. Impacts to Section 4F resources are called uses. The term use means to adversely impact or to occupy a Section 4F property. Common types of use include right-of-way or easement acquisition of the Section 4F property, restricting access to the property during construction, or temporary occupancy for construction purposes. The link provided on the slide contains detailed information on the different types of Section 4F uses that could occur because of the project. Types of Section 4F uses include de minimis, a temporary occupancy, an exception as an enhancement, and an individual Section 4F evaluation. Uses categorized as de minimis would cause minimal impact to a Section 4F property after considering all avoidance, minimization, mitigation, and enhancement measures. De minimis uses require public involvement, completion of the de minimis checklist, signature of the owner with jurisdiction or OWJ, who is the owner and manager of the Section 4F property, and Federal Highway Administration concurrence or approval. When a Section 4F use exceeds or does not fit with the previously described uses, an individual Section 4F evaluation is required. Individual evaluations require public involvement, completion of the individual evaluation documentation, written concurrence from the OWJ, and Federal Highway Administration concurrence or approval. Additionally, a Categorical Exclusion 2 document referred to as CE2 or higher level of NEPA classification is required. Individual evaluations can cause substantial project delays if they are not started early in the project development process. An enhancement exception occurs when the project purpose is solely for preserving or enhancing an activity, feature, or attribute that qualifies a property for Section 4F protection. Enhancement exceptions do not require public involvement or Federal Highway Administration concurrence. However, like temporary occupancy, the enhancement exception does require written concurrence from the official with jurisdiction over the property. Temporary occupancy occurs when the impact is so minimal it does not constitute a Section 4F use or the use is temporary, minor, without adverse impacts, and the land is fully restored to its original condition or better. Temporary occupancy uses do not require public involvement or the Federal Highway Administration concurrence. However, the official with jurisdiction over the property, for instance, the City Parks Director, must provide written concur with the temporary occupancy determination. A Section 6F resource is a public outdoor recreation facility acquired or improved with Land and Water Conservation Fund, or LWCF, grant money. All Section 6F resources are also Section 4F resources, but not all Section 4F resources have not been funded with LWCF funds and therefore are not Section 6F resources. To determine if a Section 4F resource is also a Section 6F resource, go to the Missouri State Parks website. Section 6F resources are displayed by county. Conversion of a 6F property requires replacement land of at least equal value and recreational owner of the Section 6F property and Missouri State Parks. Missouri State Parks coordinates with the National Park Service, who reviews and approves conversion and replacement land. If it is determined that project impacts would convert the Section 6F property to non-outdoor recreation purposes, federal regulations require replacement of the converted land rather than monetary compensation. The district and environmental staff will determine the type of replacement land that will fulfill the mitigation requirements. Completing the land conversion and replacement requirement is often a 1 to 2 year process. The district should provide MoDOT environmental staff the project location, complete project description, new right-of-way and easement information, road or trail closure and detour information, and any known Section 4F or Section 6F resources associated with the project. The district and environmental staff will assist with any outside agency coordination. MoDOT environmental staff will prepare the Section 4F and Section 6F documentation unless it is in the consultant's scope of services. If the consultant prepares the documentation, MoDOT will review and submit it to the Federal Highway Administration as necessary. The district should inform consultants who may be preparing the Section 4F or Section 6F documentation to coordinate with the environmental specialist and not to correspond directly with resource agencies or the Federal Highway Administration.